Okay, so let's get this one thing out of the way, alright? Knights did bad things. Can we all just agree on that? Knights did some bad things. And some good things. You know, I hate that I have to use this playground logic, but it seems some people are under the impression that we don't understand this simple reality that human beings are imperfect and some will do heinous things. The contrarian talking point that has been floating around since the early 20th century, that knights aren't actually noble and loyal individuals, is not new. It's where we get concepts like dark knights and black knights in literature. Knights are certainly prone to evil, just as they're prone to good. And unless you're a child, I think everyone knows by now that this is the case with any group of people in history. But if you are a child, I doubt you'd be watching videos like this one we're about to talk about. Today, we're looking at the top 10 horrifying things you didn't know about knights from Top Tenz. Now, this video is pretty old, I think it's about 5 years old, but misinformation has no age and should be addressed. Now, these guys released a similar video called Top 10 Horrifying Things You Didn't Know About the Samurai, and the Metatron already addressed that video years ago, and I will link it in the description because it's actually a really good video. I do recommend it. He does a perfectly good job explaining the fallacies and out-of-context points made, and I feel no need to address it myself when it's already been done well enough by an expert in the field. But this is the one I'll be looking at, because as far as I know, I don't know anyone else who's addressed it, but it needs to be addressed. Before we get started, let me give this guy some credit. They did post sources in their description. So after I look at their points, I'll be taking a look at their sources as well to see how they match up. Hey, give credit where credit's due. If you use sources, that's a step up in the right direction. Most people I respond to don't even do that. So let's take a look.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching Top 10's Net, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 horrifying facts that you didn't know about knights. Number 10. They barely ever had to work.
For the most part, knights in feudal Europe were expected to swear their loyalty and their sword to a lord or king and become their vassal. In return, the lord or king would give the knight several hundred acres of land to call his own. This allowed a knight the opportunity to make himself extremely wealthy if he so desired. So you're probably thinking that in return for several hundred acres of land, a giant house, and slaves to do all the dirty work, knights would be expected to work pretty hard, right? Well, as it turns out, knights were expected to do no more than 40 days of work per year. This work could consist of stuff as simple as escorting the lord and his rapidly swelling backside to and from a hunt. Of course, it could also include going to war, but...
Okay, let's hit the pause button right there. Firstly, knights had slaves? No, they were serfs. Those aren't the same things. We'll get into that later. Secondly, knights barely had to work. All right. What constitutes work? Taking a look at your first source from Botanica.com, which is a little funny because that's like the de facto source. I don't want to use Wikipedia, so I'll quickly use the encyclopedia. It says that knights were usually required to serve no more than 40 days. Now, I've never heard that before, so I did a bit more research of my own to see if that was true. And from what I found, it turns out that the 40 days of service thing is just an estimate based on a few documents and letters recovered. However, it depends highly on the location. For example, knights in the Levant and Crusader kingdoms were sometimes called on to fight for 4 months at a time, let alone 40 days, so I think it would depend on what kingdom and under what circumstances. But let's take a look at reality for a minute. What's to say a knight wouldn't stay and finish fighting? Let's say that they're fighting, right, and the fighting is going to last longer than 40 days. Why wouldn't they stay and stick around a little longer, especially if their own personal interests were at stake? Remember, if the feudal lord that the knight fights for is about to be defeated and routed, the knight gains nothing by abandoning that lord in his time of need. That lord is his source of vitality, the reason he has land in the first place. Why just get up and say, all right, guys, it's been a fun 40 days, but I'm done? Look, I'm not saying knights didn't do that. I'm saying it doesn't make sense to. Plus, bear this in mind. Not every military engagement required knights. They were the elite warriors, the Navy SEALs of the ancient world. You might not need them for every single battle. And finally, what do you think they did while they were at home? You're only talking about their military duty. What about when they're at home? Now, the thing is, I would tell you what the duties of a knight were outside of battle, but you're literally going to lay them all out later in the video, so I'll just let you contradict yourself. That makes my job a whole lot easier. Moving on, number 9.
Number 9. During battle, they were highly unlikely to be killed.
During the heyday of knights, warfare was a much different beast than it is now. The role of knights in battle was vastly different than what you'd probably expect. Their real value came in the fact that they rode horses. That's something common foot soldiers were forbidden from doing, even though the horses were the real MVPs of feudal battlefields. The perceived value of knights was such that in battle, conscripted peasants and common foot soldiers could sometimes face severe repercussions for killing one, even if the knight was fighting for the other side. This is because captured knights could often be ransomed back to their lords. This same courtesy was not granted to the common soldiers mentioned above. Many of those grunts would be slaughtered instantly if they were captured.
So, knights were rarely killed. Again, you will contradict yourself later in this video, but let's just address your point. The fact that most knights were on horseback does give them an advantage. You're definitely right. But do you want to know what started cropping up around the 13th and 14th century? Swiss pikemen, soldiers trained to counter cavalry. Horses would get speared by the pikes or they would stab the riders off their horses, and there goes a huge tactical advantage. Plus, crossbows came along later, which could punch through some armor, which made some of their armor obsolete. As time went on, knights became less and less invulnerable, Plus, what happens when knights fight other knights? Their knights are trained to fight other men in armor, so it's not like they're completely invincible. And while a horse is a useful tool, it's a great way to gain an advantage in battle, it doesn't make you unkillable. But you move on from that point and talk about capturing and ransoming knights. You say that a kingdom could keep a knight alive and then ransom them back. But common foot soldiers were not so lucky. They were killed on the spot if captured. Well, I took a look at your source, which I don't think you read all the way through. According to this BBC article you linked about the ransom of medieval soldiers, knights were ransomed their worth, but so were archers and other foot soldiers. According to the article, soldiers were ransomed their worth based on yearly pay. Quote, "It goes far beyond the knightly circle," he says, with mechanisms in place for paying to recover prisoners. The phrase prisoner of war first appeared in the 1420s in a Latin and French form, recognizing how the protected statues of prisoners had developed and the responsibilities of their captors. It was much more contractual than expected. It was very much a contractual business. Patriotism was not the driving force to encourage enrollment, and ordinary men would have been reluctant to join armies willingly if they faced death upon capture, says Dr. Amboul. Despite official disapproval, the financial incentive was so strong that it continued on a large-scale basis, says Dr. Amboul. It was a very effective system. This proves that ransoming soldiers actually encouraged some soldiers to enlist because they believed, if the battle was going poorly, they might be shown mercy and allowed to be ransomed. Better to be ransomed and sent home than to die, right? This encouragement to war, reducing the necessity of knights slowly, and now you're starting to see a pattern. It actually helped out. It went beyond the knightly circle. Just about any soldier could potentially be ransomed. They would just be cheaper than a knight. A knight might be able to get you a lot more money. You might want to read the full source next time, and I will leave all of his sources in the description for my audience to read. Number 8.
Number 8. Chivalry only applied when they wanted it to.
Chivalry, along with being a thing that guys in fedoras online complain about being dead, was a basic code of conduct knights were expected to live by. It espoused the tenets of basic respect and honor. Though the chivalric code is a thing that existed, few knights actually followed it. The reason we think they did has largely been attributed to medieval romantic literature, which often portrayed knights as unwavering sentinels of justice. In reality, knights did whatever they wanted because they could, and they only showed respect to those of a higher station. During war, knights frequently looted, pillaged, and raped. They would raid villages for supplies, indiscriminately killing serfs, farm animals, because screw them, we guess. This practice was so widespread that many knights considered looting to be their right. Accepting the booty, both metaphorical and literal, they took for themselves was something they thought they were owed for their service.
Let's answer a quick question. What is chivalry? Well, it depends on what realm of the medieval world we're talking about. To some, it was being respectful, honorable, and kind. To others, it was being good in battle and a skilled warrior. So what definition of chivalry are we talking about? Because different areas of medieval Europe probably had different ideals of chivalry, different things that they attributed chivalry to. But I imagine you're talking about the former, being respectful, honorable, and kind. So let's address that. Let me ask you a real quick question, okay? If we get our modern idea of knights being noble from 12th century romantic literature, then why was the romantic literature written in the first place? Surely, if all knights were hypocritical douchebags who raped, abused people, killed indiscriminately, massacred peasants, and looted what they wanted, then no one would ever write them in a positive light. After all, Vikings did all those things too, and they weren't featured in a positive literature. So why would we just ignore that unless there were some knights who did uphold the codes of chivalry? Certainly not all of them. Yeah, some knights probably did horrible, horrible things. But enough of the knights did good things that it was the ideal that we immortalized. But let's talk about looting, raping, and killing serfs. Okay, looting. Yes, looting was a common practice for any army because they needed supplies. The further you are from home, the more you need supplies to continue waging war, and rather than keep stretching supply lines thin, you could just take what you needed. Not always a good idea, sure, but different time periods. There were no air helicopters coming down with boxes of Red Cross and UNICEF supplies, you know? You gotta take what you can get, especially in a long, drawn-out war. Raping. Yeah, sad to say some knights probably did this. It's not unheard of for men to do this in wartime, but to imply it's unique to the knights would also be false, and to imply all knights did it is equally false. And then killing serfs. Why on earth would they want to kill serfs? If their goal is to conquer and take land, the knights are going to need those serfs to work the land. Killing the serfs doesn't help anyone. You just basically made the land unworkable. You have to find new serfs to work the land now. Now, I took a look at the 3 sources you used to support this. One is just a brief article summarizing the Crusades. It doesn't mention anything significant. But you know what? That makes sense, because if we're talking about the Crusades in terms of looting and pillaging, it makes sense they would loot and pillage. The Crusades had the knights leave Europe and go into the Middle East. The supply lines are stretched very, very thin, and in order to get the supplies, they would have to loot the supplies they needed from the towns and cities. The other article is on Chivalry from knightsandarmor.com, which is a community-built website without an academic source to support it. Granted, it does mention the knights looted, pillaged, and slaughtered when given the chance. But what were those chances? What was the context? Were they low on supplies so they needed to loot and pillage? Were the people inside the city continuing to resist so a slaughter ensued? But the crazy thing about this is none of the sources you give mention rape or killing of serfs. I find it interesting that you bring that up. You say that in your video, but none of the sources you provide imply that. Did it ever happen? Maybe. But your sources don't support it. I think you might just be projecting a little bit. But okay, you know what? I'll give you credit for this. You're right that not all knights followed their oaths and codes of chivalry, but not all police follow their codes of conduct on their protocols. Does that mean all police are evil? Not all soldiers in the military follow their regulations, rules, and guidelines of war and military discipline. Are all soldiers evil? Some people, given power, will misuse it. Some, given power, will be humbled by it. Please don't lump in the collective by the actions of the minority. In some circumstances, that could be called bigotry. All right, number 7.
Number 7, only rich kids could become knights.
The route to becoming a knight was rigid. It essentially limited knighthood to kids who today would have names like Quentin or Chet. While poor or common folk could become knights if they did something exceptionally badass during battle or saved a lord's life, they were equally likely to be killed for embarrassing someone who had the foresight to be born with money, meaning virtually all knights were nobles of some kind.
Dude, whoa, oh my god, you literally just contradicted your own point. You just contradicted yourself in less than 15 seconds. Okay, you start by, your point is only rich guys could be knights, and then say some poor folks could become knights. No, stop! Your point is moot. You're done. You literally, within the next 15 seconds, just destroyed your own point. Only rich guys could become knights. And yet some poor men could become knights. During the 11th and 12th centuries, it wasn't uncommon for common foot soldiers to be knighted for acts of valor on the battlefield. Your source that you use literally points this out. Yes, it was expensive to be a knight, so usually the wealthy and nobility became knights. You're not wrong. But then why are you saying only rich people became knights? When your source clearly says that technically any free man could be knighted. Keep going.
This kind of makes the fact knights could punch poor people in the head or take their stuff all the more jarring. By virtue of their birth, knights were almost always independently wealthy.
Maybe a little off topic here, but I gotta know. Your video is called 10 horrifying facts about knights. You even capitalized horrifying. How is this horrifying? Class schisms and wealthy abusing the poor is nothing new. Again, some knights might have abused the lower class while others didn't. It depends on the individual knights. But just the idea that only rich people can become knights, even if that's true, how is that horrifying? I mean, I'm never going to be a movie star because I'm not rich or famous. How horrifying! I'm never going to get into politics because I'm not rich and powerful. How horrifying! Your video is about horrifying truths about knights, but so far not much of this is really that bad. And besides, I think most folks knew that knights were nobility. I mean, why do you think they were given land in the first place? So that they could become wealthy enough to acquire what they needed to be knights. And the whole punching peasants in the head thing, knights have a vested interest in keeping their peasants happy, but we'll get into that later. That's for later. Moving on.
Number 6. Gathering in big groups, picking fights, and harassing women.
As noted above, knights generally only followed the parts of the chivalric code they wanted. One part of that code states that a knight must always be ready to defend his honor if it's challenged. To take advantage of this, it was commonplace in the 14th and 15th centuries for large groups of knights to gather at well-traveled areas like bridges and rivers. There, they would pick fights with other passing knights trying to go about their business. As you can imagine, peasants would often avoid these areas like the plague. The risk of being attacked by a bored knight was extremely high. Likewise, any man attempting to pass with his wife would be expected to fight for her honor. Nothing says chivalry like harassing a guy's wife until he gets angry enough to punch you. If a woman had the audacity to attempt to pass by without a man, the knights would accost her until she handed over a piece of clothing. She'd then have to ask a knight to go get it back.
Oh, wow, you are taking this out of context. You're talking about the passage of arms practice. This was a common event in the 14th and 15th century where a single knight or group of knights would take hold of a bridge or pathway for travel and challenge a passing knight to fight to prove their honor. If the knight refused, it was a sign of humiliation, and they'd have to leave their spurs behind as a sign of defeat. If they did fight, usually they were not killed, but simply allowed to pass, but they were beaten and humiliated. And finally, if a woman tried to cross without a knight escort, they would not harm her. They simply asked her to leave a glove or garment behind and then ask a knight wherever she was going to come and reclaim it for her. Now, why did they do this? Just boredom? No. It's because the 14th and 15th century was when the knights were beginning to die out. With the advance of the Swiss pikemen who made cavalry near useless, the advances in crossbows which could punch through armor, and peasants getting hold of some of these weapons, it meant that everyday peasants now had the ability to kill knights on horseback from a distance. Knights were becoming less and less essential. They were dying. Many knights who read the 12th century romantic literature that you were talking about earlier wanted to retain their honor and tried finding ways to prove that honor and chivalry had its place. They didn't want to die. They wanted to stay relevant. By challenging traveling knights to duels, they were trying to remind themselves that they still had a purpose and to remind those that they fought that the codes of honor still mattered. In many ways, it's this kind of act, like the passage of arms, that shows a very sad decline. To me, it's tragic, seeing old men in armor desperately clinging to their old ways and the traditions that they valued. Old soldiers who believed so firmly in their codes of conduct and honor and chivalry that they'd go to desperate lengths to maintain it. But it's become a part of the romantic vision of knights. In fact, some of these instances were almost games, like the Pass of the Shepherdess in 1449. Noblemen were required to dress as shepherds and defend a woman dressed as a shepherdess crossing a bridge from the local knights who pretended to be bandits or enemy soldiers. The nobleman who held them off and won would receive a kiss and flowers from the shepherdess. It was practically a game. We also see it portrayed in literature, like in Robin Hood, where Little John guards a bridge that he and Robin fight on. This is an example of the passage of arms. And hey, know something crazy? That's not me asserting anything. Your two sources, your Wikipedia articles that you used, they all say this too. Again, please read the full source for context. Moving on.
Number 5. Jousting was pay to win.
Few aspects of being a knight have been romanticized as much as the idea of jousting. You know, the sport involving two men in plate armor attempting to poke each other in the face with sticks from horseback. Initially, it served as a way for two knights to test their skills against one another. Jousting armor, as it was known, often weighed in excess of 100 pounds. It was so heavy that the wearer could barely move. He was usually only being held in jousting position by the armor itself. While skill undeniably played a role in determining the winner of a joust, rich enough knights could simply buy armor so ridiculously heavy that it was nearly impossible to unhorse him. That made winning vastly easier. Poorer knights, meanwhile, had to make do with the same armor they used for battle, which was designed for battle as opposed to dominating face-poking tournaments.
Again, how is this horrifying? It's just information about jousting. And the pay-to-win thing, you are aware that just having good armor doesn't always guarantee you'll win, right? Henry VIII is famous for losing a jousting match in which he suffered a severe brain injury. And he would have had the best armor. But this is just a dumb point. How is this horrifying? How does this prove anything about the knights? I feel like you're fishing for problems now.
Number 4. Women couldn't become knights, but were expected to do the job of their dead husbands.
Like so many of the coolest jobs in history, being a knight was exclusively reserved for the owners of a penis. Their wives were expected to sit at home, not learning to kill people with a broadsword, their bloodlust going offensively unsated. Unless their husband died like a moron, that is. In that case, women were expected to fulfill all of their husband's knightly duties. This included protecting their lord and making sure his land didn't fall into disrepair. Only women didn't get any of the cool stuff that came with it, like respect or acknowledgement by history.
Oh yeah, the women didn't get any of the same historical respect and honor that their husbands got, he says after shitting all over the legacy of their husbands. You can't sit there and claim that the women didn't get the same level of reverence as knights when the whole premise of your video is that there's nothing to respect about knights in the first place. Your contradictions are getting insane, and it's about to get worse.
The duties generally expected of a knight's wife included everything from organizing the defenses of their estate to arranging marriages for their servants. This was on top of being at the beck and call of her husband 24 hours a day.
Okay, lot to cover here, so bear with me. Remember how earlier you said that knights only had to work 40 days a year, and I pointed out you'll contradict yourself later? Here it is. If the wife's job is to adopt the duties of her dead husband, which, side note, how can he be dead? Didn't you say that they rarely died? Oops, guess continuity bit you that time, huh? If she has to adopt the roles of her dead husband, then why wouldn't all these duties be the knight's as well? Clearly, the knight has duties to do at home if the wife has to pick them up while he's away. But let's ignore all of that and look at the source you provide. I'm convinced that you found this source, didn't read much of it, and just decided to add it without actually caring about what it said. Let me read it for you. Women in Work in the Middle Ages by Pat Knapp and Monica von Zell explains the roles of different women in the Middle Ages. In fact, I looked at this source in doing my Medieval Women's video. It breaks down the roles of women according to class, but since we're talking about wives of knights, let's only focus on the first class, the lady of the manor. Here, the article lists out the typical duties of a knight's wife while her husband was away. Keeping the tenants' houses in repair, sorting out complaints and legal disagreements at the local law court, supervising the renting out of lands and property to tenants, solving problems with bad workers, organizing the defense of the estates when they were attacked, supervising the repair of damages and buying new things, being responsible for running a household of hundreds of people, supervising the preparation of huge amounts of food and other household goods, much like, managing a small hotel or restaurant, supervising workers, making medicines and watching over the sick, a local nurse or social worker, and monitoring the behavior of all the peoples living in her house and helping to arrange their marriages. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read all that, I was incredibly impressed, especially when I read the above bit about Christine de Pizan, who was widowed at 25, had 3 children, and still ran her estate with distinction. In fact, she says something here quite interesting. Her quote says, quote, "Because that knights, squires, and gentlemen go upon journeys and follow the wars, it beseemeth wives to be wise in all they do. For that most often they dwell at home without their husbands who are at court or in diverse lands." She also says, quote, "The lady who lives on her estates must be wise and must have the courage of a man. She should not oppress her tenants and workers, but should be just and consistent. She should follow the advice of her husband and of wise counselors so that people will not think she is merely following her own will. She must know the laws of warfare so that she can command her men and defend her lands if they are attacked. She should know everything pertaining to her husband's business affairs so that she can act as his agent in his absence, or for herself if she should become a widow. She must be a good manager of workers. To supervise her workers, she needs a good knowledge of farming. She will be sure to have adequate supplies for the spinning and weaving of cloth, for the wise housekeeper can sometimes bring in more profit than the revenue from the land. Now, I know that was a lot to read, but it all serves a point. Notice a few things she says. She should not oppress her tenants and workers. Why is that? Didn't this guy say knights were free to beat up and abuse tenants and serfs? Maybe she said that because that's not what a knight was supposed to do. Because it might cause trouble. Food for thought on that one. She also says women should seek counsel from their husbands, understand the laws of war, command the troops, handle their husband businesses, learn how to farm, learn how to spin wheels and make profit off of it. You know what I call that? Strong, resourceful, independent, smart, progressive. Why do you, the creator of this video, why do you look at it and say, women couldn't go out and fight like men and partake in all the stuff I said was bad a minute ago? So sexist. Dude, why do you keep contradicting yourself? You spent the last good while of this video talking about how awful knights could be. Now you're saying because women can't go out and kill like they did, it's somehow sexist? I'm reading all these things that knights' wives sometimes had to do while their husbands were away, and I'm going, wow, those women were pretty strong. That's some strong, independent women stuff right there. That's real progressive for the medieval age, where people assume women did nothing but act like damsels in distress. That's kind of impressive. And you're looking at it saying, how sexist. Please, read the full source. Let's keep going.
Number 3. Knights could nearly be killed trying to woo a woman.
Women, as throughout most of recorded history, got a rough deal in the era of knights and chivalry. However, ladies of high enough standing did have some say when it came to being wooed, and boy did they take advantage of that. The most notable example of this is likely Ulrich von Liechtenstein. Yes, the character from A Knight's Tale was based on a real guy. He tried to woo a noblewoman in the 13th century and nearly died in the process. The lady being wooed took particular exception to being courted by Liechtenstein, both due to his appearance, he had a hair lip, and the fact that he already had a wife. So, like her movie counterpart, she made Ulrich do a whole host of activities to prove his love. Totally innocent and sane things, like cutting off his finger, competing in jousts, wearing a dress instead of armor, and sleeping amongst a group of leprosy-infected peasants.
Ladies watching this, if I have any lovely women in my audience, please answer me this question. If a man risked his life for you or died for you, and said it was because he loved you, would you be moved by his gesture? Or would you think that it was horrifying? Because if I was a woman and a man put his life on the line for me, I think I'd be quite flattered. Maybe even a little enamored. Now, sure, in the case of Ulrich, he was already married, and the woman he loved was already married too, so that does complicate things, but it was his own choice to do all this. Yeah, funny thing about that story of this guy, she never made him do any of this. In fact, she consistently mocked him, belittled him, and insulted him for bothering her. He constantly chose to do all these things for her in the hopes it would win her heart. Now, all of that said, all that we know about Ulrich von Liechtenstein's story comes from his own autobiography, which we have no way of knowing if it's accurate or not. So, yeah. But again, if I was a woman, a lovely maiden, and a knight put his life on the line for me, I think I'd be very, very grateful. I would not see it as horrifying as this guy claims it would be. But what do I know? But let me bring up another point. You said knights very rarely got killed. Apparently, though, you think that they constantly got killed because they were just trying to win over a woman. What are you trying to say, buddy?
Number 2. Knights treated serfs just terribly.
In feudal Europe, serfs were considered to be the lowest dregs of society. They were even lower than farm animals because at least you could eat those.
So serfs wanted to be eaten. What are you talking about?
Though serfs were technically protected by the lords of the land they worked, lords and knights could freely beat them or demand their property. Serfs had to pay for anything they took from the land since it belonged to their lord. Taking it without permission or due payment was a crime that often resulted in a severe beating. Serfs couldn't marry or even travel without a lord or knight's permission, meaning many serfs died without ever having travelled more than 5 miles from the place they were born. Since they were integral to the upkeep of a lord's land, serfs were often the first target for knights. Some knights would intentionally not kill serfs, but instead severely wound them by hacking off a limb. That way, there'd be a drain on the landowner's resources.
Do you remember that quote from Christine de Pizan? Yeah, gonna bring that up again. She made it very clear not to upset or abuse the serfs. Wanna know why? Because peasant revolts are a thing. Here's a hypothetical. Let's say that a knight starts abusing his serfs, beating them, robbing from them, and hurting them in excess. What do you think the serfs will do? Well, at best, they'll stop working, and at worst, they'll openly revolt or leave your land. So, how do you get them back to work? I mean, if the serfs aren't working, your land is worthless. Your land can only be profitable as your serfs make it. So, if they stop working, your land means nothing. That's why you want to avoid pissing off the serfs. They might be peasants and servants, but they still keep your place running. That's also why you didn't want to hurt serfs of the enemy's land. You want them alive and working, so that when you capture the enemy's land, you can put them back to work only for you now. You need people at the workforce. Hurting them and injuring them will make them want to leave and stop working. This is just common sense. And here's the crazy thing. I checked your source. Yeah, and the only thing your source affirmed was that serfs couldn't leave the land they worked on or get married without the Lord's permission, which is true. Why? Because the Lord needs to keep track of who gets taxed, how much profit is being made, and if he can afford for serfs to stick around or leave as they please. A lot of what you put here isn't supported by your own sources. You're fabricating stuff now. Shame on you.
Number 1. Becoming a knight used to mean being slapped across the face.
As seen in movies, the process of knighting a person today usually involves lightly tapping the person being knighted on the shoulder with a sword. The exact origins of this tradition are unclear, but it's believed to originate from the idea that a young squire wasn't ready to be a knight until it had a weapon buckled against his armor during battle. A squire couldn't readily rely on this happening, so a symbolic gesture was created, one that involved hitting the squire across the face and then on the shoulder with a sword. How hard the squire was hit generally depended on how big a jerk the person knighting him was. You can probably imagine that many squires started their first day as a knight with a handprint on their face. Though it was customary to only lightly hit the squire, since it was the only hit in his entire life the squire was required not to return, some knights took advantage of the opportunity to be a tool without consequence. They'd give the squire a punishing, jawbone-shattering backhand to the face for absolutely no reason. Something we, for some mysterious reasons, feel absolutely fine about.
3 things here. Number 1, congratulations, you finally got one right. Yes, this is correct. Number 2, how is this horrifying? And number 3, a slap to the face is the best hazing they got? I've seen fraternities with more intense hazing and initiation rituals. Your entire premise of this video is, these are all horrifying aspects of the knights you never knew. And frankly, this number 1 big horrifying thing is so freaking tame. A slap to the face was the original knighting ritual. Yeah, so? Samurai cut their stomachs open in a form of seppuku in order to retain their honor. Native Americans scalped their enemies. Vikings performed bloody eagles on their defeated captives on occasion. And let's not even go into what some of the Seljuk Turks did. A slap to the face is nothing. So that about wraps up this video. How do we conclude? Like I said, I'm not going to reply to his samurai one or pirate one, but let me summarize what they all amount to. Hello, I'm a man with an accent, so you know you can trust whatever I have to say. Did you know that insert historical warrior here didn't live in the 21st century, and they, in fact, didn't always adhere to moral values that I believe they should have? Allow me to present 10 things about these heroes that may or may not be true, but I found some random sources that might prove my points, so I'll drop those in the descriptions and hope you don't read them yourself. Please just believe me while I misrepresent historical figures and insert my own morals onto individuals of the past who would not have shared my worldview and ideals. Now, you might think that's a little unfair of me, and yeah, that might be true, but is that any different than how he treats knights, samurai, pirates, or Spartans in his videos? He presents half-truths, faulty reasoning, and sources that don't support his own claims. He uses overdramatic and cherry-picked incidents and vocabulary to sell his story, and the end result is a list of 10 things about the Knights that are mostly untrue, and even if they were, don't really count as horrifying to anyone but him. I have no ill will to this guy personally, but his video was just awful. But I hope y'all enjoyed this response video though, and I hope that you'll consider liking and leaving a comment down below about your thoughts. What do you think? Do you think that this guy had any good points to make, or do you think that it was all ridiculous? Please leave a comment with your thoughts. Please don't forget to subscribe, because subscribing really helps the channel out, and I will see you in my next video. Take care.